Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me as always is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
Exceptionally well, thanks for asking, Rory. You have joined us for episode 142 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We've got three topics that we're going to be discussing today, starting off with what is the right environment for counselling. So we're going to be kind of talking about the environment that counselling is best suited to. Then our next topic, we're going to check in with our very good friends at CPCAB awarding body, where Rory, you spoke with Ray van der Poel, and the topic that you discussed was what else CPCAB does. And I think that people would be a bit surprised by this.
Absolutely. In our interview, Ray outlined their vision, a new vision for mental health, and Ray talks about how that is being rolled out and their view of what positive and healthy mental health should be.
Love it. Looking forward to that one. And then we are ending episode 142 by dipping into Practice Matters, which is the section of our podcast for our qualified practitioners. And Rory, you had a chat with Kath Nibbs on the topic of working with children.
Yeah, absolutely. The fab Kath Nibbs, PhD candidate. She's just in the middle of doing a PhD, a real specialist in child work. And she gives us a real insight into what skills and what thinking is needed when you're working with children.
Looking forward to that as well. So starting off with the right environment for counselling.
Yes, and it's an interesting one. This topic came up in our Facebook group. And if you're not a member of our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll find us. We're a closed group. Just knock on the door. Of course, we're going to let you in. And you can join the party, which has thousands of like-minded people, students of counselling, qualified practitioners, and of course supervisors, some lecturers, all talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. And this came up in the Facebook group. The right environment for counselling. It's also a question that's asked on at least one exam board's paper, and within the criteria. And I think it's really interesting. There are just so many things you have to think about when you are having an environment for counselling. In other words, where you and the client, or where yourself, if you're a student, you're a listener and a speaker, client's your speaker, sit. And there's quite a few things to keep in mind. I mean, first of all is accessibility. The room needs to be accessible. And that means thinking about, can everybody get in there, including people who use wheelchairs? Sometimes that's not available. It can be really disappointing if people can't get in. Now, there are times when there's things like listed buildings where they can't put a wheelchair ramp in, but I think it's only correct that that's told to people in advance, and some other form of direction is used. You might have to refer someone on to someone else. Also, things like health and safety and fire alarms. If someone comes to you for the first time and there's a fire or the fire alarm goes off, I think it's useful right at the beginning, and even in the contracting stage, just to point out where the fire exits are. And in fact, for people who are actually counselling to know where the fire exits are, should be part of a induction package. If you're doing your placement, someone should take you through the fire drill. And also, I think decoration. The room should be set out for counselling. It shouldn't be a room that's just used for a multitude of things, like a storeroom. Ladders in the corner, a few paint pots on the desk, a few brooms in the corner. It should be really set out to support people. And there's a few things that really need to be taken into consideration. It may be that you get a client who maybe has difficulty with body positivity, who doesn't want any mirrors in the room. I've had that in my practice, where we've had to cover the mirrors or move mirrors out of the way. And also the colour of the room. Some people are triggered by colours. And if a client says, I can't go into a room that's painted green, and your counselling room is painted green, then you're going to you can't just repaint the room for one client. That's not a reasonable adjustment under the Equalities Act, you may have to find an alternative venue, or even decline that client, because obviously you can't say, oh yes, come in, and then they turn out and find that the room is a colour that triggers them. So I think those are real things to think about when you're having the environment of the room. Is it a safe place, and is it a place where counselling and inner work can be done?
100%. And thinking about anything that you have that is personal, maybe pictures of your family should not be present within your counselling room. Maybe you have a specific faith. You wouldn't want to maybe have any symbols of your faith around in your counselling room. You'd want to keep that as neutral as you possibly can. And it's interesting, as we're speaking about this, I can almost hear the pens going, Rory, as students that are on a counselling course, because this does come up in assignments. It's asked quite a lot, kind of scribbling down, and you're going to hit the criteria by kind of putting in what Rory and I are discussing here. But for me, there was a big shock. I'm going to be honest here. There was a big shock in moving from study into actual placement when I was now face to face with clients. I had in my mind what the ideal, and changed it from right environment to ideal environment, and I'm doing like little inverted commas there, of a counselling room looked like. And I ended up working in a doctor's surgery, and it was far from the ideal picture that was in my head. I didn't have control over the colour of the walls, the decorations that were in that room. It was a multi-purpose room that was used for taking blood tests and a variety of other things. It was a very clinical setting. It wasn't warm, and what I would have wanted if I'd have kind of set the practice up myself, which I did, of course. I went into private practice, and then I was able to build that in. But what I then went to is, what are the basic bare minimum requirements that one would need for counselling? And for me, they are as follows. Number one, we're looking at confidentiality. So you need a environment or room where the person will feel safe to bring their material. So an example of what would not be suitable is a client or a room where a client can hear people talking outside in another room, or at a reception desk, or somebody answering a phone. If you can hear them, then the thought in the client's mind is, they might be able to hear me. Therefore, what I'm talking about is not confidential. I can't bring that with confidence. A window that kind of looks in to the room that you're working in, where people might walk past, glance in, and see the two people sat there in the room. The confidentiality is blown. Many clients seeking counselling or psychotherapy may choose to keep that private, confidential. They might not want other people to know that they're going to a counsellor or a psychotherapist. So that is something to consider of what you really, really need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I pick up on your point, Ken. Sometimes, the rooms aren't ideal. You have to make a kind of professional view. I know in terms of soundproofing, the room I use, occasionally if someone walks past in the corridor and they're talking, you can hear them. Thankfully, very few people use the corridor. So yeah, you have to take a view on that. But I think the other thing that creates the environment, and it's sometimes missed, and I know when this question was asked when I used to mark this paper, is the actual environment created by the therapists themselves. That is a big contributor to the environment, using those three core conditions, as we sometimes refer to them, as empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard, skills of attending, really good listening skills, allowing the client to speak about what's going on, all contribute to the environment. So when we're talking about the environment, it isn't just the physical environment, it's the emotional environment created by the working alliance.
100%. Oh, yeah, it's going bing inside me. You've hit the bell for me there, Rory. That's what it's all about. And that's what I found working in my first placement, where I wasn't too happy with, I guess, the state of the room. I didn't feel that it matched that idyllic picture that I had in my mind. But what I found was that once the session started and it was myself and the client, everything around us disappeared. And it became about our relationship. I didn't see the room anymore. The client didn't see the room anymore. We were working in the material. So you're 100% there in that you as the counsellor, you are bringing part of that environment. And I'll share a tip. I'm going back to how disillusioned I was when I saw this room for the first time. I think there was a mop and a bucket in it when I was first shown the room. My little heart was sinking. This was going to be my first place of counselling. So I took it to my supervisor, and we spent best part of a whole supervision session before I actually went in to see my first client. And my supervisor shared that I can bring my own kind of props along to the room. So I brought a little mat that I put down. I brought a little side table on which I could put some tissues, that if the client felt the need for tears or showing those emotions, that something was on hand. And I was able to create, just with a few little props, a little section within that room, which was now the counselling place. And I guess I felt a lot better about that. And maybe it was respectful for the client that they came in, there was a little mat laid out and a little section for the actual counselling to take place in.
Yes, and I think that the lesson that's to be taken away from this is, of course, that sometimes we don't get always what we want. Our fantasy of what the ideal counselling environment is can not quite match up to the reality of it. And as Ken has really well outlined, you can make the room your own. You can take in a mat, your tissues, a little clock maybe. You can even put some flowers in, as long as people aren't allergic to pollen, and just make it your own. And it kind of signifies. And I like the term you use as props, because that props set the stage in theatre. And of course, you're setting the stage for the theatre, the opening of therapy, which is very much like a theatrical opening, where the curtains go back, the players come on, and the dialogue starts, and the whole of the play plays out.
I like it. You've just mentioned clocks there. So kind of as clocks refer to timing to move on to our next topic. But before we leave clocks, when we're talking about the right environment for counselling, keep in mind, if you're placing clocks within your counselling room, that they should be silent clocks. Just go on Google and type in silent clocks. There's some cracking silent clocks out there. And also place your clocks in a way that both the client and yourself can see the clock. Very often when I worked with supervisees, they would have a clock that they could see so they could hold the time boundaries. But the client also wants to kind of maybe glance at the clock every now and again, know how much time they've got left. Maybe they want to bring a new presentation, something that they've been meaning to bring, been a little apprehensive to bring, and they look at the clock, have I got time to bring that? So make sure that the clocks are viewable by all. Now there's a download, a super duper download, one of Rory's super hot downloads, and you can get this. It's on the right environment for counselling. That's what the download is called. It is free of charge. All you need to do is go to our website, counsellingtutor.com. From our main homepage, click on the podcasts tab. You'll see it. It's very clear to see, and find your way to episode 142. On our show notes page, that's what we call it, all the information we talk about in this podcast, we've got kind of external links, additional information, and of course you can get Rory's super duper handout on the right environment for counselling from that page just by putting in your email, and it will be sent to you. So speaking of clocks, speaking of time to move on to check in with CPCAB. Rory, you spoke with Ray van der Poel on what else CPCAB do.
Yes, I mean, a lot of people would recognise CPCAB as an awarding body for qualifications, an exam board, for want of a better phrase. And many people don't realise exactly just how committed CPCAB, an organisation who organises and issues counselling qualifications, just how they committed are to mental health. And when I spoke with Ray, he talked about one of their ideas called a new vision for mental health. And it links into what's called the power threat meaning framework by someone called Lucy Johnson, where they're looking at the traditional biomedical model, where someone would sit down and say, what's wrong with you, to a more social model, a more kind of inclusive model, where you sit down in front of someone and they say to you, tell me your story. And they're trying to create an environment where mental health is seen mainly in the narrative and not as a kind of chemical imbalance, if you like. And this is the social model. This is the social model of mental health writ large. And they have a website called A New Vision for Mental Health. And it's really, really interesting. And it's an idea that's gaining traction. Some of the more traditional established ideas of why we have poor mental health based in biomedical ideas, our brain chemicals not working or syncing up properly, is now being replaced by a more kind of intuitive and a dialogue with the client, as opposed to kind of just pushing medication out there. It's really worth listening to, because it is the environment that we as counsellors work in.
Well, let's listen to it right now as we check in with CPCAB.
Check in with CPCAB.
So we're here with Ray from CPCAB, and we're asking the question, what does CPCAB do? What else do they do? Because they're seen as the awarding body. Some of you listening to this may be on a CPCAB qualification, but there's a lot more to the organisation than that, isn't there, Ray?
Yeah, hi Rory. Really nice to speak with you again. Well, the thing that I wanted to bring to people's attention a little bit in this check-in was that the idea that CPCAB, although an awarding organisation, and that is our primary function, we do have other projects, and we're always looking to give resource to students. But one of our sort of philosophies is we're committed to a well-being society. And I think as a student, sometimes when we are on a course and it's all in enveloping, if that's the right word, but you get sort of sucked into this little bubble of doing your course. And actually, if we think about counselling, it's within the mental health sector, but it's always good to understand how things are changing within that sector as background information, as a practitioner, as a counsellor. And we've come up with this website. It's called New Vision for Mental Health. New Vision for Mental Health. And what we've done is we've said, if we were to redesign the mental health system, what would it look like? So it's about expressing all the great things that are current in mental health, and what's happening. And what we began to notice, and it's been going for a couple of years now. What we've began to notice in the mental health field is the shift in paradigm between the biological, biomedical model to a different type of paradigm, to a different model of way of working with mental health, one that includes looking at somebody holistically. And I just want to pick out a couple, if I can, a couple of posts that we've put on there that I feel sort of show the breadth, because the New Vision for Mental Health website it sort of says, mental health, you can improve your mental health by doing cold water swimming, which is great. I don't know if you've ever tried that, Rory. But a lot of nodding.
I'm not nodding here. Yeah, I have. Yeah. And I can tell it was cold.
It was cold.
Yeah.
But also, the two pieces of information that I want to share is the British Psychological Society Division of Clinical Psychology released a new framework, and it's a shift away from the biomedical model towards a different type of way of working. And it's specifically designed for clinical psychologists and psychiatrists. And what it sort of does, it's called the Power Threat Meaning Framework. And Lucy Johnston and colleagues, 2018, so really current, have put this framework together. And where you normally sit down with a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist and they say, well, what's wrong with you? Basically, that's what they're asking. They're looking for symptoms.
Yeah.
They're looking for, what's wrong with you? And then it feeds into this biomedical model where they, a lot of the time, prescribe medication. Well, Lucy Johnson and colleagues have come up with this idea that what happens if we don't say what is wrong with you, but we ask a different question, like, what is your story? Mm. And I think as counsellors, this really fits into our way of working. This idea of what has happened to you, that sort of inquisitiveness, and they link that to the power differentials in your relationships. What has happened to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I say, in the traditional biomedical model, you go and see a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and with great respect to our colleagues in that sphere, historically it would be about diagnosing and literally, like, if someone came in with a broken arm, what's wrong, we can fix that. And I think the term paradigm is interesting. Paradigm, as I understand it, is an agreement by all, usually in the scientific field. So if you drop a penny, or for those listening in another country, if you drop a coin onto the floor, it will always hit the floor, because that paradigm is gravity, and everybody agrees that we have gravity. But the world of mental health isn't like that, and the attitudes now are kind of shifting from, as you say, treating with medication, which has its place, to more of an understanding of the individual story and what happened to them, as a way of looking how someone can almost self-treat themselves, how they can be in the world with the difficulties they're having.
Oh, that is really well put, and I think that we've sort of suggested that we're moving more towards an ecological paradigm. This idea that as human beings, everything is very complex. It's multi-layered. There's complexity with the person at the center of it, but actually there's a whole environment that surrounds that person. And when I think back, if I had to link it to person-centered theory, Mearns and Thorne talk about this idea of social mediation. And what is that? That's about somebody making change in their life at a pace that socially is acceptable to what's going on around them. Anyway, this post, this power threat meaning, have a look at it. How did things affect you? What sense did you make of it? What did you do to survive? Or all the different types of questions that moves away from diagnosis and symptoms, but more to a meaning. So what does this mean for you? How would you like to resolve things?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a welcome change, because in the mental health world, there's been an acknowledgement that part of it, a lot of it is how the individual perceives it. There's a big link to phenomenology here, perceived experience. And, blanket terms like depression, sometimes universally, they're not helpful, because depression is just a word. And when you're sitting in front of someone, they're an individual, to gain a sense of where they are in the world and to see a wider context is so important. And I think it's a welcome change, to be honest. In terms of the power threat meaning, what does that actually mean, Ray?
Yeah, sure. The power threat meaning it's about what Lucy Johnson is saying is that actually in somebody's life, there's different types of powers. There's so, for instance, if I was at work and I was dealing with my superior, my boss, then there would be a power differential. Or if somebody was, for instance, if we go right the other end of the spectrum and somebody was abused, then there is a power difference there. So what forces are acting against you that has meant that something has happened to you? So, for instance, this idea of abuse, that is an authoritative power that has come against you. And the threat is, well, how did that affect you? So because you've been through that experience, what has that meant? Has that meant that you find it really difficult to form relationships? And you might be performing a cycle of many, many different types of relationships, but still not being able to maintain them. And then what sense did you make of it? And this is the meaning part. So by talking about it and saying, actually, when you're in your relationships, what is that like? And really teasing that apart and bringing some meaning to it. And then what did you do to survive? And this is where it really begins to take a life of its own, is that actually something's happened to you. It means that you've started behaving in a certain way, and you had to do that to survive. So it's not something like you're a bad person, you're incompetent, this is how people survive. So you've survived it, and then it moves on to power again, and look at, so what are your strengths? You have survived this, so how can you use those strengths now to come through that particular experience, for instance?
It's a radically different approach to, what people would, certainly in my generation, would see as traditional mental health support outside counselling. I can remember many years ago supporting a client who had OCD when I was a support worker. I went to a CPA, care program approach meeting with a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist said, and I quote, OCD is not something that psychiatry deals with. And then we found ourselves in the corridor. And I had to source some external help. So the idea that it's a more of a holistic approach, that it might be a multidisciplinary approach, then we might fit in as therapists in one area, but there might be other support in others, is essential. And I think it acknowledges in a very direct way that, we're not just a diagnosis, we are a sum total of our lived experience.
For sure, and I think that's this shift in thinking that we're not a symptom, we're not a diagnosis. We have a story, and we've come through that story, and we can come through that story.
Absolutely, Ray, and I think that's definitely food for thought. So as always, Ray, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rory.
Check-in with CPCAB is proudly sponsored by CPCAB, the only awarding body run by counsellors for counsellors. To learn more about CPCAB qualifications and to get more detailed information on today's podcast topic, visit cpcab.co.uk.
Well, I think hats off to CPCAB on this.
Round of applause.
Yeah, let's have a round of applause.
Yeah.
This makes them so much more than an awarding body. This shows real commitment to mental health and wider society. And I say they should be applauded for this, because it is about what counselling is about. It's not about sticking to the status quo. It's about research, and CPCAB are all about the research. I can assure you of that. And as a consequence of that, the research is pointing more to a discussion, a dialogue model, than maybe a chemical, drugs-based model. And I've had a look at the website. People should go. It's called A New Vision for Mental Health. It's basically a vision for it, and it's absolutely wonderful. And I know that a lot of clients, who've traditionally been through the biomedical model and then have come to someone who says, well, just tell me what happened to you as opposed to what's wrong with you. It has been a revelation and a road to cure. And to get that link, if you didn't pick it up from the chat on the podcast, you can just go to our website and get that link anytime, counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, go to episode 142. All the links relevant to this episode are there. You can just click on it and go and check out that website. So I guess we're speaking CPCAB. They are an awarding body. So they kind of serve learning institutions and as you said, Rory, exam board. They kind of set the criteria. We're moving away from study and into practice to our qualified practitioners. A little while back, Rory and I recognized the need for a continuing professional development, online, on demand, which is kind of how we deliver our study resources. And we created an online, on-demand CPD library. And today we're kind of dipping into that library with a topic that kind of comes up very regularly in our Facebook group. And this is working with children. Now, I know, Rory, you spoke to Kath Nibbs on this topic. Kath has worked extensivly in the sector working with children. Share a little bit of what we can expect from this. Well, Kath Nibbs is a very experienced child and adolescent therapist. She's a PhD researcher. She's a UKCP member, and she's absolutely committed to working with young people. And what we can expect is her to outline how different it is working with young people than it is with adults, and touching a little bit on how the meta models that we learn for working with adults may not transpose easily to working with children.
Let's get right into that with Practice Matters.
Practice matters.
So we welcome Catherine Nibbs, who's a child and adolescent therapist. So welcome, Catherine.
Good afternoon, Rory, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, yes, Catherine and myself are great friends outside of the world of broadcasting and online work. And Catherine's a child and adolescent therapist. It seems so simple on the face of it to be a child and adolescent therapist, but I'm sure as you'll outline, it's not as simple as that. What do people have to think about if they want to get in or practice child and adolescent therapy?
Very succinctly, Rory, you have to consider everything. As I've said to you on numerous occasions, children don't come context-free. They belong to the society in which they live. They belong to the family of origin. And when we work with children, quite often we end up being more of an advocate as well as the person in the therapy room. So there's a lot to consider, which, the lecture does go into most of that. So it's a huge area.
It is, and it's one where I think a lot of people think I've done a counselling course, I've got my level 4 diploma, ergo the meta model that I've studied must fit for children. Is this true, Kath?
In all seriousness, no. So there's a whole heap of areas that we need to consider when we work with children. Most importantly, the phenomenology, which is the worldview of the child. And to understand that, we've really got to go back to basics and understand about neuroscience and child development. And it's been really fabulous to see that quite a lot of the membership bodies have actually taken this into account in terms of the competencies that they're now saying that to work with children, you need to be able to understand these areas. And it's not really understand the areas as an overview. It really does need to be in depth.
Yes, it's not just a case of applying a model to a child, because you have to take in areas such as, I would imagine, child development. You mentioned phenomenology, the idea of the child's lived experience, and as one of my favourite philosophers, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, pointed out, that children have a completely different phenomenology to adults.
Yeah, absolutely.
What would that look like? Why would a children's worldview be different to an adult's one? It sounds like a straightforward question, but I'm really interested in kind of teasing out why a philosopher would say a child's view of the world was different to an adult's.
Well, there's lots and lots of as you've coined the phrase earlier today, meta theories around why this happens. But essentially, children are developing, and that means that certain stages and ages, their brains are capable of understanding things in a particular way. You've got to take into account their ability to do things in the world. So a toddler cannot do what a 6-year-old can do, and a 6-year-old cannot do what a 12-year-old can do. And this is why certain perspective and models, and the way that we work with children, they won't work with children. So, for example, CBT, which is cognitive behavioural therapy, it's impossible to do that with a child under the age of about 12, because they don't have the ability to think in a cognitive way that adults do. And this is one of the issues about children, is they are still progressing through the world, and therefore each day they mature is a new way of seeing things. So I think Ponte is very good at kind of pointing out that children have a very different view of the world, and actually that grows with maturation. So it grows with age and complexity.
Yeah, I think that's something that's kind of missed a lot when people think of child and adolescent therapy. So the message is clear that you need to understand child development, child brain development. You need a wider understanding of a child's environment, be that the family, the extended family, their points of origin. I'm also interested in the idea that that you could do standard counselling with a child. I know that in our many conversations that when we meet, you talk about advocating for the child, being an advocate, and that sounds a bit counterintuitive to counselling. It sounds almost like maybe coaching, or even in maybe kind of a more supportive role. Can you just expand on what you see as the advocating role of a child therapist is?
Yeah. So when we talk about advocacy, we're talking about our ability as the therapist to be that child's voice in the world. So very often decisions are made in and around children and what's happening for them. So, for example, most children are brought, and the brought is in inverted commas, to therapy, usually with some form of either POP diagnosis or actual psychopathological diagnosis. So children tend to arrive at therapy with, issues such as anger, or they've had this life event which they need fixing. And it's about understanding that when we work with children, we have to take the time to understand what it means for them to be brought into counselling, what it is that we can do in order to help them. So, for example, we might be working with a child who's got two parents that have separated. So they might have divorced, and the child is brought by one parent. And one of the things we need to be able to do is say, okay, does this child want to be in therapy? Can we actually work with this child if they're not particularly keen to be in therapy? And that differs to that of adults who generally come to therapy because they want to be fixed or they want to heal, if that makes sense. And being the advocate for the child, we can often talk to other adults, other grown-ups, and we can help those adults understand what it is that child needs in order to heal from wherever they are. And by doing that, there's a very nice phrase, team around the child, and I think it's about the context. If we don't fix the context in which the child exists, then that child continues to stay within that environment without the aid of the adults around them. And that's really what we can do as child therapists.
Yes, I mean, I think that's just so important. The child has only so much agency, where an adult is generally free to make decisions in the world. Yeah. So maybe speaking with caregivers about how they are in the world, maybe even speaking with caregivers about their own history of being parented.
Yeah, often that is what I do, Rory, and I speak to, on behalf of the child, I may speak to the school to help them understand what's happening for that child. So I might be working with a child who's grieving, a child who's traumatized, and giving that environment the information about, okay, this child isn't, as is often quoted, naughty or kicking off. What's happening for them is there's a dysregulation in their emotional ability to communicate with you because of, and it means we can actually advocate and we can talk to other people about the process without ever breaking confidentiality for the child. So we can almost be psychoeducational on behalf of the child so that the child's environment is supportive and aids in healing.
Yeah, so speaking with those that surround the child about what the child needs to be able to self-heal and to flourish in the world. It's not just a case of what the child can alter, but it's also about how the environment the child is in is positioned. Yeah.
And research shows that you can't work with a client who doesn't want to do the work. So creating that space and environment where the child can be contained to then engage in the process through their own autonomy and empowerment is really the kind of essence of what we do when we take everything else into account.
Yes, and Kath's lecture goes into this in great detail about what it takes to be a child therapist. And I've known Kath for a long time, very passionate about the work, a very talented child therapist. I know Kath might not kind of acknowledge
well, you
that.
Can't see me blushing.
So it's a great opportunity. Kath, thank you so much for catching up with us on the podcast. And Kath Nibbs, thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Rory. It's so insightful, and it just makes me think of all of those kind of questions that come in specifically from students who are saying, can I go and work with children in my placement? There's just that recognition that there's so much to it, a lot of moving parts. This is really a very specialist area, and I guess a very rewarding area of what we do as counsellors and psychotherapists.
Yeah, absolutely. And children deserve the best possible service that we could offer. I think sometimes that might be missed. We talk about, offering an ethical, professional service to clients. And I think some people think that as, adult clients, but children, should have the best possible service. And in service to that particular client group, additional training and additional understanding of things like cognitive development and child development is absolutely essential.
100%. And this kind of keys into a lecture that we have on our Counsellor CPD site. If you're interested in our Counsellor CPD site, you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, please just go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is there. And really what we're doing is we're covering the topics of interest, creating certified CPD modules where you can claim a certificate for that, kind of put it towards your CPD for the year on a range of topics. And they are on-demand formal lectures. So it's not two people just having a chat. It is a formal lecture with learning outcomes, with a formal lecture with a slide pack download, audio download, and of course your certificate after that. So hopefully, we are kind of, I guess, hitting a need on that, because we've heard so much, that the traditional model of CPD is maybe going to a conference or taking time out of work. And this gives you an opportunity to dig into these topics, important topics, from the comfort of your own home, really, from your tablet or your laptop.
Yeah, isn't that fantastic? And we know that people's time is precious and there just doesn't seem to be enough time. So why not do your CPD in the time that's convenient to you? So what a great episode 142 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. We started off with the right environment for counselling. Ken and myself talked about, what that environment should look like and how rooms should be set out, and also practitioners' attitudes, all contributing to the environment. We moved on, and it was quite nice that we moved on to talk with Ray van der Poel from CPCAB, who talks about a new vision for mental health, CPCAB's manifesto for the change of mental health and how we engage with people in distress, and a fantastic initiative from CPCAB. And then we finished with the Fab Cath Nibs talking about working with children, outlining what skills and what we need to think about when we work with children and how different it is to working with adults. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.